Hi, I'm Andy Dent. I'd like to start by thanking our sponsors. I'm here to talk to you about Lottie and tooling around the Lottie ecosystem. Lottie is an animation format that, as you can see from this professional scale diagram, is a lot smaller than some of the ways you may be putting animated items on your web pages. If you attended my talk in 2019, or if you want to go back and look it up on YouTube, I talked a lot about Disney's principles of animation, and these first few slides relate back to that talk as well. I still break down animation into 3 reasons why. So the first one is just to amuse yourself or your user, to give them a little bit of delight in the app and the user interface. Sometimes you want to distract people. How long does it take to load something? So it's your classic loading spinner. Or when you're getting started, if you have an app that unfortunately takes a long time to get going. Or talking of getting going, you may want to be informing them about the onboarding process, or just have a button like this Hamburger Menu here that animates to provide a hint as to maybe where they should be looking next. So let's talk about Lottie. Lottie is a great open source project. It's one of those big success stories, partly because it comes out of companies with deep pockets and a real need. So it started out as a web exporter for Adobe After Effects. After Effects, which some of you may be familiar with, is the big product in motion design. And somebody wanted to have that out to a web player, and fortunately for us, they built an intermediate format using JSON. Airbnb used this so much on their website, they wanted to put it inside their native apps, so they built some really cool native libraries that are amongst the best of breed in how to do graphic rendering of vector graphics, and release those as unencumbered open source. This has become quite an ecosystem, so I'm going to talk about alternatives to Adobe's product, Keyshape, Flow, and Synfig. There are also other products because this is a simple format to export to. Even the venerable 3D Blender has got a Lottie plugin. So why does text matter? Text is a great intermediate format. Anybody who's ever been in a complex tool chain and had to wrestle with a binary format knows you don't want that. In particular, if you are dealing with version control, text allows your version control system to operate really efficiently. And if you need to chase up weird differences in behavior, the last thing you want to do is be doing a visual comparison of 2 different visual renderings side by side, when it might come down to a few characters difference in text files you can diff by hand. And sometimes you just need to tweak the color because somebody changed their mind about the color blue, and you need to go through and do a global search and replace. If you have a visual editing tool that does styles, that's easy. If you have one which requires you to go and hand edit it in 32 different places, it's a nightmare. You can see here the little hamburger, Lottie, and an idea of what Lottie JSON looks like. There's about 100 lines of this stuff here for that shape. Lottie Files is the dominant site for downloads. You may be in normal icons used to having a plethora of sites where you can get the icons, be they PNGs or SVGs. In the Lottie world, Lottie Files is pretty much it, and has grown into a commercial marketplace. So let's go over and have a look at Lottie Files. Oops, sorry. I shall bring up the Lottie Files site I opened earlier, just to save it taking a while. As you can see here, Lottie allows you to search for different hamburgers. So if you were looking for some design inspiration on what your hamburger micro interactions could look like, you can find it here, even if you're not going to use one of these as a starting point. Lottie Files also includes a simple editor. So we're going to go and play a little bit with the lolly that I had and play with the melting lolly colors. As you can see, as it's loaded, even a really simple animation like this one has got a lot of different components. Let's see what happens when we try and change a few colors. So changing the color of the stick is pretty easy. Let's say I want a different flavor of lolly. I'm going to go in for something that's kind of like a cool one on a hot day, something nice and icy. Oops. And you can see here why you want to maybe go back and do that quick search and replace I mentioned earlier, because now I've got all these other drips and drip shadows I probably want to go and tweak the colors of. So, having edited this, you'll notice there is an export available. So I can just drop this little JSON file straight down onto my desktop, or if I'd done a superb job of editing it, I could put it back on Lottie Files and put a description there as to why green lollies are much better than pink ones. So let's go back and look at, skipping over my pre-saved screenshots, the graphical editors we're really here to learn about. I'm going to talk about 3 products here. Synfig is your classic cross-platform open source product. So Synfig is interesting to use, a little bit more fragile than the others. Most of the keyboard controls will be control keys rather than command keys for Mac users. It's free, so you could go in and, hey, if you notice anything you don't like, you can always go and fix it and submit the source code back up. It's an older product as well, and if you've used Blender 3D, for example, it'll seem familiar to you. It's quite an awkward product to use. Once you get used to it, however, it's amazingly powerful. I'll talk about that more in a minute. Keyshape is a commercial product. That $47 once-off price you're seeing, that's a Mac App Store download, so you can put it on multiple seats for yourself. And Flow is a much higher-end product that does user interface animation and a lot more code generation and export features I'll come back to, which is why it's got that extra price. All 3 of these provide the ability to draw within the interface, but Flow started more drawing, importing from a sketch drawing, and so their emphasis is still more towards tweaking within the tool. So, and by the way, Adobe After Effects is $30 a month, unless you've got one of those great specials or you're doing a high-end bundle. Let's talk about Synfig. So it's more for people who are doing 3D movies. Rather than doing little user interface animations. But it is a visual editor you could use to do those animations, and it's the only one that works on Windows and Linux. So it may still be something you want to consider. But as something that's aimed towards people who are doing 2D animations, you've got the ability to animate faces, you've got the ability to have people walking and doing animations of the body. And it's very much about tweening between positions. So let's go over to Synfig and see what that looks like. So I'm going to start off with a new document, and I just crashed Synfig. Remember I said Synfig Studio is one of the more fragile things. This goes with it being a cross-platform open source product. So apologies for that minor hiccup there. Let's see if we can launch it again. Right, we now have a stage on which to work. So I'm going to draw a little circle here. We'll pretend for now this is a bouncing ball. Like older style graphic tools, you often go in and you use a tool to move things and adjust them. So all I'm going to be doing today is just using the move tool, but I'm going to make this animated. So to make it animated, I go and turn on animation mode with the little green person, and we are now in an animation recording mode. Remember I said this is movie oriented, so it talks about frames, and I'm going to jump to 1 second in the timeline. So down the bottom here, all animation products have some kind of timeline, literally how things change over time. In this case, it's moved what they call the playhead to this position, 1 second, 24 frames. And at 1 second, I want the ball to have moved down to here. I'm going to jump again to 2 seconds, and at that point I want the ball to have bounced up to there again. Normally if you're going to animate this you would squish the ball when it hit, but we won't worry about that for a simple demo like this. So I'll jump back out of this mode, very modal stuff because that's your classic old style approach, and let's go back and look what my little animation looks like now. Boom, there we go. I now have an animated moving ball. I'll save this in my animations folder, and animations are exported to Lottie from Synfig using a plugin. So I can now do that, and it's created a JSON plugin for me. If I go over into my animations folder, I've got Rec Day with a little HTML display. That's Synfig. Now let's talk about Keyshape. Keyshape is a great vector editor. If you wanted to do animations from scratch, even if you're just putting out movies or GIFs, I would recommend this as the Mac tool to use. As I said, it's only $47 to install on a few of your devices. Their import-export is via plugins, and those are all open source. So if you want to fix their plugins or customize them or do your own for a different format, you can go ahead and do that. And as you can see from the error message I snipped below, the melting lolly was just a little bit too much melting gooiness for it to cope with. So I like that little black hamburger I had earlier next to the text demo. Let's go over to Keyshape and bring in the hamburger. Because I've already installed the Lottie plugin, the JSON files show up as files I can open. And you can see in the preview there, that really is ugly JSON. But when it comes in here, it is beautiful animation. Now, because we're not just importing a graphic, but we're importing a full-blown animation, we've immediately got a timeline down the bottom here, which shows the animation of all of those parts. And I can play it and you'll see it quickly animate. And I can also scrub the playhead backwards and forwards through the timeline to see things at my own pace. This is a commercial product. It's been around for years, and so it does look a little bit more friendly and polished than Synfig Studio. Oh, the other thing I didn't mention, Synfig Studio, the documentation is a little bit thin because it's an open source product. Go ahead and add documentation to it. People would love that. Keyshape and Flow have both got superb sites with lots of documentation, lots of video tutorials. So what I'm going to do to start with, I'm looking down here, I notice we've got ketchup here, but this is a black animation. And I loathe the thought of black ketchup. It brings back horrible thoughts of share houses and bottles that should have been discarded years ago. So I'm going to change my ketchup to a more appropriate ketchup color. And I did that by selecting the path here that's under the ketchup on the left-hand side. And I've now changed that to red. But it's not showing up. That's because the ketchup has yet to drip. So if I play with the playhead, there goes the ketchup and it's now red. Okay. The person who designed this likes their bun to pop up at the top. I don't particularly like the timing of how that bun's popping up. So let me introduce you to the concept of timing curves. Here we have the timeline showing how things change, and sometimes you want them to change at a different pace. If you look closely on the timeline here, this top bun has got a position changing in a linear mode, which means it changes evenly, but the shape is changing with a Bezier mode. What that means is, if I go down into their Bezier editor, their timing curve editor, that Bezier is that shape. So it's actually pretty close to a straight line. It's changing about the same rate. I want that to pop up a lot more. So I'm going to drag these handles, and if you've ever done any spline editing in any visual drawing tool, this is exactly the same as editing curves there. It's just this is a timing curve rather than a space curve or a shape curve. So, having modified that, let's see what happens. Now when I play, there's a little bit more pop as the bun goes up. So I'm pretty happy with that. So, having done all this, I'm now going to export it. My export formats, because I have the plugin, include Lottie. And I'm just going to call that my rec day Lottie because I don't want to overwrite the one I started with. And I'll put that in my animations folder. Now, unlike the other ones, I don't get a nice generated preview HTML. But remember, Lottie Files is a very comprehensive site. So let's go back to the Lottie Files site. And amongst the Lottie Files tools up the top here, in the design area is a previewer. This allows you to take any JSON file you've found somewhere else or you've created with one of these other tools and preview it on the web. So here's my hamburger rec day that we just edited. And when I open it on the Lottie Files site, ta-da, we have a poppy bun and red ketchup. So Lottie Files loves you to share, and I could go in and share right away. But I think we've done enough with that for now. So let's go back to our presentation, and we'll skip through a couple of carefully saved screens and talk about Flow. As I said earlier, Flow is focused on user interface animation. So whilst it includes Lottie export for the web, it's also got native code wrappers for Lottie. So it'll export a workable iOS or Android project you can show your Lottie within. And very quickly mention a non-Lottie topic. One of the reasons it's so expensive is it does these compilable native animations. So if you had 20 buttons that were animated, apart from driving your users crazy, that screen would probably have something like about 160K worth of assets if they were Lottie files. If they were generated as native compiled stuff, that would come down to maybe 2K of binary change. So Flow originally started importing from Sketch. And the important thing to know about this is a tweening thing where it is mapping the starting artboard, and an artboard in Sketch is just a container for a bit of a drawing, to the ending artboard, and they have to be utterly identical. So structurally they have to be the same. I've just hand edited a bit of the DDD logo here, and you can see I want to end up with some eyes on there. If you look down here, you can see I've actually also got those eyes on the starting position, so my structure is identical. However, the opacity is turned down to 0. So let's whiz over into Flow and create a new document, and I'm going to link a sketch file. I could be starting from Figma, which is in beta, or I could be starting from an SVG. So when you open the sketch file, it'll go through and it'll do previews of all the artboards in there. I've only got the 2 in here, so I'm just obviously going to drag the one I called Start and the one I called End. That's just my convention, doesn't mean anything. And that's it. I now have an animation. So it's immediately, it's worked out, it should interpolate between those two. So if I play that, I've got those two shapes moving and the eyes appearing, which is the opacity being animated. Down the bottom, we have what's possibly now becoming familiar as a timeline, and they actually call it a timeline, which makes it really obvious to you. And you can see the attributes it's worked out that it's animating between there. So I don't know if there was actually any change in the X position. Obviously the Y position, things moved up and the opacity changed. So let's say I wanted the green to be a little bit cheeky and to start winking at us a little bit earlier. So the winking effect is basically just the opacity. When does the eye show up? I'm going to scale my timeline so it's easy to edit, and I'm going to make that eye open an awful lot earlier. Now let's see what happens. There we go. In fact, that's all a bit too quick. So why don't I go and slow down my timeline? So I'll make it 4 seconds long and I'll scale it. If I just wanted to add extra animations at the end, I'd say expand, but I want it stretched over that time. So now I have a 4-second animation. I'll go back to the beginning. And that eye winks pretty quickly. Let's go and play with some curves. So I want my pink to move up quickly. I don't want the eyes to vanish out of the shape, so I'm actually going to have to go in. I'm going to expand this a little bit, and you can see here I've got my timing curve for opacity, sorry, for Y position for the pink right eye, for the pink left eye, and the overall D. I'm going to change those. What am I going to do with those? Let's see. How about we're a bit slow to start? So I've got all 3 selected, and I can just drag those. Oops, I haven't got all 3 selected because I missed them. Drag that. Can't click on that one. So now I've got all 3. I'm holding down the command key to get a multiple selection, much as you would with shapes. And so if I drag those 3 over, what happens? So we're taking a 1 second start, and it slowly comes up and matches the others. But I want to have a bit of a sense of panic in there, having been left behind. So pink is going to come up with a different easing curve. So I've got the 3 things selected, 1, 2, 3. And over on the right hand side here, you can see I can choose easing. So this has got 3 keyframes selected that are all compatible properties. And let's just make it something that's a little bit slow and then jumps up pretty quickly because we started late. Let's see what happens now. Whoops, yep, and everyone else is catching up. Let's zoom that down a bit so you can see that again. Voila. If I want to export that from Flow, File, Export, and I say I'm exporting to code, and I can now choose a Lottie web format. I've got to choose my timeline. And if I open that, you see we have a nice preview again in which we can see our animation. Okay, and with that, finished Flow. So we've discussed 3 tools you can do with visual editing. Remember, Keyshape allowed me to bring in the Lottie document and visually edit it. The other 2 could only export to Lottie. And are there any questions about Lottie or animation in general? Thank you.